Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is the Holy Post Podcast. I'm Phil Vischer. I am here with Skye Jatani.
Hello, Phil.
Hi, Skye. And Jason Rugg.
Hey there.
Hi, Jason. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, thanks. And we have sitting in for Christian Taylor, we have Kaitlyn Schiess. Hi, Kaitlyn.
Hi.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Welcome back. Kaitlyn Schiess has been on a couple of times now. She's the author of The Liturgy of Politics. She's a seminary student. She's a Liberty grad. She's what's your favorite hobby?
Cooking.
She's a cooker. Are you good? Are you good?
Isn't a cooker an appliance?
Yeah. I just made her an appliance.
Yeah,
she's
a person.
She's a rice cooker.
Thank you, Skye.
Okay. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay, the reason I asked Kaitlyn back on is because there's something coming up. There's an event. It's coming up. We're in a season, some sort of a season. It's like pumpkin spice season, except everyone's angry. What is the season that happens every 4 years in the fall, right about the same time as pumpkin spice season, that makes everyone angry? Anyone? What is it? Got it? Anyone got anything?
Cicadas.
No, that's in summer.
Every 4 years.
Is it the Winter Olympics?
It's election season. We're in the middle of election season, and we are, as we record this, we're like, 8 days away?
7.
7?
6.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
7 days away. So it's, Kaitlyn just looked terrified. Are you okay?
It's just a lot quicker than I was thinking in my head.
Heart palpitation. I wanted to, because this is our last chance to discuss it before it happens. And you say, is this a political podcast? No, it's not a political podcast. It's a podcast about living Christianly in culture. But we also talk about what season are we in? And it's not pumpkin spice season, even though it is, but I'm not allowed to sit in a Starbucks, so it doesn't really matter. It's like pumpkin spice season was just skipped this year. It's like Christmas never came. And instead we have this election, which is not a good swap for pumpkin spice season, but it's all we've got. So I want to have Kaitlyn back on because there's just so much going on. And I thought her point of view would be fun. And we're going to grill her and make her take really unpopular stands. And then we're going to disavow those stands. Didn't know she was going to say that on the podcast. Had no idea she was going to go there. She had such a promising career. Oops. That's my plan anyway. We'll see. Yeah, we'll see how it goes. I actually wanted to start out with, because we put out a video. Skye. Skye put out a video on abortion. I didn't have anything to do with it. I don't know how I ended up being like the first face that you see on it.
Yeah, the person introducing it.
Yeah, Skye did some deep fake magic with other footage of me and made me introduce his controversial abortion video, and now the whole world is mad.
Can I just say, one of my favorite negative responses was somebody after the video said that Phil Vischer needs to step down. That
really?
you need to resign and step down. And I thought, step down from what?
From what? Don't I need a job first?
But that's what you get for being in the introduction of the video, Phil.
I'll step down as the introducer of Skye's videos that they're going to prove to be controversial. So, Skye, did you think the video would be controversial?
I knew it would stir the pot.
Was it okay? Scale of 1 to 10. What did you think it would be on the controversy scale, and how close is it instead to a Spinal Tap level of volume?
I think it actually garnered the response I expected.
Okay.
I wasn't surprised by, I was very encouraged by a lot of the positive responses. I was not surprised by the negative responses.
Okay. Kaitlyn, have you had a chance to watch the video?
Yeah, I thought it was great. It's funny. That is the conversation I have the absolute most with people in my church, is people who say, I really don't want to vote for Donald Trump, but I feel like the logic and framework that's been given to me is I vote for the pro-life candidate no matter what. And I had been sending them the David French article about it, but now I'm sending them that video because people like watching videos more than reading articles.
So
There you go.
they're mad at me too now. And
Maybe.
my favorite response was, the guy that was the narrator, and then they mentioned Skye. Skye was the narrator of the video. Obviously, the whole video was Phil's fault. But the guy who was the narrator, I don't know if I agreed with him either.
I was just a puppet, and Phil's hand was up my rear end the whole time.
Hey, now it's time for News of the Butt.
There you go.
So you've been having those conversations, Kaitlyn, and does the David French article, did you find that to be effective? Have you found the video to be effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are looking for a more nuanced explanation of the way that they should relate to government, because the options they've been given on both sides are so intense and so about making a statement of who you are and a statement of everything I believe has to be encapsulated in this one vote or this one person. And the idea that they could kind of have that burden taken off of their vote and off of themselves is appealing to them. And not just because it's like an out or like a cop out, but because it really gives them some freedom to say, I'm not beholden by this one single rule. I have all sorts of considerations I have to take in place. And to feel like if my primary consideration for the presidential vote is not abortion, that doesn't mean it can't be my primary consideration on other votes. It doesn't mean I don't care about it. It doesn't mean that I can't, volunteer or donate to a local crisis pregnancy center or be involved in other ways that aren't just this one vote. Instead, it's like, oh, that's an opportunity now. My vote can, represent all these other things that I care about. It doesn't have to only represent this one thing.
And I still may end up voting the same way for the same person, but I have permission to take in a larger range of factors.
Yeah, which is also, I think some people don't like that because it's been simple and helpful to just be like, oh, I just know how to vote.
Right. If you have two candidates and one of them wants to kill everyone and the other one wants to kill no one, it's really easy to figure out how to vote. So do you think we've become kind of addicted to that kind of clarity?
Yeah, but also at the same time, I think just what 2016 did was force people to recognize that there are other really serious moral considerations when it comes to their vote as a Christian, to say like you have uniquely Christian concerns when it comes to how nations treat foreigners, when it comes to racism, when it comes to, people's economic and their physical well-being, like all of those things suddenly complicated it. And so on one hand, before that, it was really, I think if you had seen a video like that or the David French article, you would have been disturbed to be like, well, you're messing with my simplistic logic about this. But then 2016 happened and it's like, okay, now everything is so complicated, but I still feel the pull of the logic that was handed down to me by my parents or pastor. And then in that context, it's like, okay, well, that's relieving to know that like there are other things that I can care about that I can participate in politically.
Can I throw something else into the conversation that we didn't address in the video? And that is
totally, Skye, throw it.
As I've been reflecting on responses to the video, I think people fall into kind of three categories. Pro-life voters fall into three categories. I think there are the people who are eagerly looking for a pragmatic solution, which is really what our video was trying to address. There are those who see abortion as a symbol. They're genuine and sincere in their opposition to this issue, but it's a symbol, and they want a government and a country from the national level on down that opposes this thing that they believe is unrighteous and ungodly. But then there's this third category, and I think the data would suggest there's a lot of evangelical voters who use abortion as a shield. And the Lifeway research that came out in 2018 about what issues were most important to evangelical voters is really telling. So that data, which is available online, maybe we can link it in the show notes, showed that abortion ranked 7th in importance for what determined evangelical votes. So there's a lot of people out there who say it's the one thing above all else that determines the way they vote, but the data would suggest for a lot of them it's not. That they use it as a shield to say, well, it's about babies. It's about the unborn. It's about this black and white moral issue. When in fact, the top issues were the economy, healthcare, and immigration were far more important in determining how people vote. So a video like ours going out there takes away some of that moral shield from them. And maybe they have to be more honest that the real reason some of them are at least voting for Donald Trump or the Republicans isn't about abortion, but that was a really helpful, righteous excuse for why they voted for them. Again, there may be good reasons to vote Republican, but when you complicate it, they don't like that.
There were some people that complained about the video simply on the grounds that you're saying I'm a one-issue voter. I'm not a one-issue voter. It's a whole. And my response was, yes, but when people study one-issue voters, and there are quite a few, the number one issue that makes someone a one-issue voter is abortion. So that's what we're addressing. If you've looked at a whole range of issues and you've come to the conclusion that you're voting with the candidate who's pro-choice or pro-life, that's fine. I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. But what was interesting, because, Frank Turek wrote a piece to attack the video. Andrew Walker wrote a piece at Southern Baptist Seminary, wrote a piece attacking the video. The Christian Post wrote a piece that just kind of reported on the video. The Federalist had a piece about the video. So you can get some attention with a video that takes a position that people aren't used to hearing, or, that goes against some sort of tribal orthodoxy. And, a lot of the responses that were the angrier ones, some were just saying, I feel like you're missing some things that the president can do about abortion policy that make a difference, or that are at risk, besides just whether or not Roe v. Wade is at risk. And some people say it is, and some people say, it's pretty much settled law. But, the Hyde Amendment is at risk. And, the Mexico City Accord, is that what it is, Skye?
Yeah, the Mexico City something or other
could be at risk, and that affects international abortion numbers. So there is more complexity, and, I think you'd agree that's true, Skye. I was going to say I agree that's true, but I didn't write the video. I had nothing to do with it. So it's what I say is irrelevant. I was just deep faked as an introducer.
Obviously, the data that we presented in the video is limited to the United States. We don't have data on the impact the American president has on global rates of abortion. And my hunch is, even there, it's minimal, but it's symbolic, right? The fact that the U.S. foreign aid might go to healthcare agencies that perform abortions is a symbolic thing that a lot of pro-life people don't want their tax dollars going toward. But what it actually means on the ground for women and children and their care is a whole nother matter. So yes, there are symbols involved in what a president or administration does as it relates to abortion. But historically, since 1980 at least, it hasn't made a difference whether it was a Democrat or Republican in the White House on the actual rate of abortion in the United States.
But don't you think, okay, I'm playing devil's advocate, but I'm also getting a lot of people telling me what's wrong about your argument, not my.
That you introduced.
That was a deep fake. Don't you think that the accumulation of Republican pro-life policy along the last 40 years, whether it's the Hyde Amendment or, it's other things that have set up state restrictions, has been a part of the decline in the abortion rate? And if those things hadn't taken place, there might be more abortions than there are right now?
I think, some people mistakenly interpreted the video as a blanket dismissal of the pro-life movement or a blanket dismissal of political engagement of the pro-life movement, and it's not. Okay. If anything, the pro-life movement has been wildly successful, especially on state and local levels. I mean, the evidence is beyond question that the implementation of a lot of their strategies, local and state strategies, have dramatically reduced abortions. The issue in the video is how much importance does the office of the president have in that effort? Right. And I agree with David French here. The evidence that I've been reading says that the impact that single office and that one election has is negligible. It's just not that important. So I'm not saying that the pro-life movement should stop its efforts where they're effective. By all means, keep doing it. I would support the Hyde Amendment being a permanent fixture. There's other things that I would approve Roe v. Wade being overturned, because I think it opens up all kinds of legislative options for solving this problem that are currently unavailable because of that court ruling. So I'm not against any of that. But at the end of the day, what I favor is the stuff that has actually been proven to help women and reduce abortions. And that's where I feel like, and David French makes the same argument, we put so much energy and time and money fighting for getting a Republican in the White House. Those resources could be allocated to far more effective strategies that will help more people. And that's the cost I think we're not factoring into our vote.
Kaitlyn, yes, no, you think he's wrong? You tell us what he got wrong there.
No, I think he's right. And I also think there's not a kind of hard and fast way for us to measure the cultural impact of tying the pro-life movement to everything that Donald Trump represents in the minds of more progressive people and more conservative people. And so is there a long-term cost that we're not factoring in, as you said, also to just the fact that not only the witness of the church being hurt in our justification of any kind of other sin for the sake of this one political goal, but also even outside of Christians, just the pro-life movement in general. There's a lot of pretty national leaders that started out being opposed to Trump and then over time, became more supportive of him. And I don't think that a lot of the average person or those leaders is considering how this will hurt them long term. Because as you said in your response article, Skye, like politics is downstream from culture. And so if we have tied the pro-life movement to a lot of other really evil things, that's not going to help us in the cultural fight that has to come prior to the political fight.
That is a good point. Okay. So also in the last week, 10 days, some other interesting things have happened. John Piper wrote something. You familiar? John Piper, very popular pastor from Minneapolis, very conservative pastor from Minneapolis, wrote a piece that's been quoted pretty extensively where he basically said, I can't vote for Trump. I can't vote for Trump. And here's why. And took some interesting positions that have, raised eyebrows. He says it's a drastic mistake to think that the deadly influences of a leader come only through his policies and not also through his person. This is true not only because flagrant boastfulness, vulgarity, immorality, and factiousness are self-incriminating, but also because they are nation corrupting. They move out from centers of influence to infect whole cultures. The last 5 years bear vivid witness to this infection at almost every level of society. So he seems to be suggesting that the flaws of a leader can have a broader or as broad an impact as the policies of a leader.
And haven't we seen that for the last 4 years?
I don't know what you're talking about.
The rise in anti-Semitism, the rise in extremism on the right through nationalism, through white supremacist groups. The FBI has been suppressing, apparently, a report arguing that the United States faces a greater threat from domestic terrorists and white nationalists than from international Muslim terrorists. So all of that's been inflamed. I mean, goodness, that fringe group that was trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan, that's the trickle down of the rhetoric that comes from somebody like a Donald Trump, who is just toxic to the entire culture. So okay. I think Piper's absolutely correct.
Kaitlyn, what did you think when you read Piper's piece? Were you surprised?
Not really. I mean, honestly, I was kind of moved by it in the sense that I think a lot of people my age are just really, really tired of watching leaders who taught us every Bible story that tells this same truth, that says a leader's, sins and flaws will impact the whole, flourishing of their nation, and then turned around and denied that when it was politically convenient in 2016. And I don't think people outside of evangelical churches, especially those in my generation, understand how much this felt in 2016 and continuing now, not just like a difference of political opinion, but like a real betrayal of trust, because it felt like we were taking the values and the stories that we were taught and trying to faithfully apply them. And then often we're told we weren't being Christians for caring about, the character of the leader that we were electing. And so honestly, for someone like Piper, who holds a similar place in terms of being kind of an elder and a leader and someone who can kind of be that consistent moral voice, I disagree with him on a lot of things. And I was still like really deeply moved emotionally to read it, because I feel like a lot of us that are my age, especially, just are looking for someone to say that.
Yeah. Okay. Joel Hunter, high profile former Orlando megachurch pastor, co-founded pro-life evangelicals for Biden. After he recently announced support for former Vice President Joe Biden, a local Christian radio station canceled his daily devotionals. He lost, and he's 72, I think. He's semi-retired.
I know Joel Hunter.
You know Joel Hunter?
I do. I haven't talked to him in years. We actually spent a day at the White House together years ago.
No way. Just you and Joel at the White House?
Yeah,
hanging
and his
out
wife.
with Melania? That sounds fun.
But I really like Joel a lot.
Did I get that right? Am I painting the right picture here? You, Joel, and Melania?
It would have been Michelle. not Melania. This is
Same difference. I can't tell them apart. After he recently announced support for Joe Biden, a local Christian station canceled his devotionals. He lost speaking invitations, and social media hostility barrage erupted. And basically makes the case. It's a little different than John Piper's case, that the character actually is an infection that is as damaging as policies can be. Joel Hunter's case is simply that pro-life can't just be about pro-birth. It has to be about all of life, and many of Donald Trump's policies and attitudes are anti-life. And, it's interesting because both John Piper and Joel Hunter are retired pastors.
Right.
Now speaking their minds.
It's amazing how that happens.
There aren't quite as many in the pulpit pastors. And then, okay, so that's Joel Hunter and the pro-life evangelicals for Biden. And then we get to Al Mohler. Al Mohler put out a statement last week, which is kind of a reissue of a prior statement, but he's just making it clear again. He was against Trump in 2016, said that if he voted for Trump, he would have to apologize to Bill Clinton. And then about a year ago, changed his mind about that, or sometime in the last year, changed his mind about that, said, actually, no, now I'm for Trump, and I don't think I have to apologize to Bill Clinton. I've changed my mind and freed myself from the moral conviction that I had 3 years ago. So he wrote a new piece, and it's arguing kind of the same thing. And it's interesting. People are... a lot of the people that even objecting to Skye's video, which I had nothing to do with, a lot of the people I'm finding, if you engage them in discussion, there's a whole lot of sin ranking going on.
Yeah.
It's like, well, that's sure. Okay. The current president is mean and nasty and vile, but that's like way down here. That's a 0.2 on the sins scale. And, abortion obviously is an 11 on the scale, so that, trumps, pun intended, everything. And Mohler does a little bit of that, but it's kind of similar to the Wayne Grudem. I remembered his name that time. We don't have to sit here staring at each other while people at home yell Wayne Grudem.
I was listening and I was yelling Wayne Grudem.
We all had a brain freeze.
Wayne Grudem, who basically said these are all the issues that are important, and Trump gets all of these issues right, and then it's a phenomenally selective list of issues of abortion, religious liberty. And what else is in there? It's abortion, religious liberty,
probably LGBT issues,
yes,
gay marriage,
and gender. Yeah, and I think even Al Mohler. If you don't know who Al Mohler is, he's probably the leading intellectual of the Southern Baptist Convention. He's the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he's writes precipitously. So he, like Wayne Grudem. It's funny, Wayne Grudem and John Piper have written books together, and they are completely on opposite sides. I wonder how that's going. Anyway, Al Mohler has a very truncated list of what's important to God. And the gender stuff and the transgender stuff, I think he actually said in his piece that was the central issue of what's going to define culture in the next few years.
Yeah, but going back to what Kaitlyn brought up about what I wrote, like law and government being downstream from culture, what would having a president in the Oval Office who's opposed to gay marriage or abortion, how is it actually going to move the needle on where our culture is on those issues? Right? It's magical thinking that if you put the orange man in the round room, that suddenly America doesn't believe in gay marriage anymore.
The man is only slightly orange and the room is oval, fella.
Fine.
So, boy, are you oversimplifying the issue.
Doesn't it? It's like a quest on a video game. If you just put this in there and then this changes, and
I have the magical coin.
Yeah,
I will put it in the magical slot, and everything I hate will go away. Kaitlyn, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean it's the same like It's ironic because one of the criticisms that I heard of your video, Skye,
Yeah.
was
Yes,
Still
that it was
introduced.
Thank
that
you.
it was
Let's be
overly
clear about
pragmatic.
that.
Uh-huh.
Yes,
Was that it was overly pragmatic,
and
right?
not principled,
Right,
Yeah.
and
which is how I
that's
describe Skye whenever I introduce him.
it's
And
just
ethnically
ironic.
ambiguous.
It's just ironic because that's so, like, not only is that usually actually a better criticism of people who are single issue abortion voters, that it's overly pragmatic, but the same is true here of just like push the right buttons, do the right thing, bam, you'll get the right result. And then the added part, the really pragmatic part of anything that has to happen to make that happen can be justified, the ends justify the means, whatever it takes. Again, are you connecting a maybe historic Christian sexual ethic with someone who denies that personally in all sorts of really flagrant ways, and also in just other moral issues is cruel and mean and doesn't value human life when it comes to, political expediency, all those kinds of things? Like, is that long term hurting you in a way that doesn't fit into a normal pragmatic calculus, but really does have serious effects on the long term viability of it, especially when, as you said, Skye, it's a cultural thing. And so if people are telling better, vibrant, creative stories about human flourishing when it comes to sexual ethics, that's how a lot of it has shifted, is really beautiful storytelling. We're not doing that by shoehorning someone into the presidency that we think will fight for us when it comes to legal battles. We would be better served by telling more beautiful stories about human flourishing, especially when it comes to sexual ethics. But we can't do that if we've had to sell our soul to get those political goals passed.
Amen. Well put.
Yeah. So Michael Weir responded. He's been on the podcast. He responded to Al Mohler's piece on Twitter with a long thread that is worth reading. Maybe we can link to it in the show notes. He says, Michael Weir says, after Mohler summarizes evangelical support for Trump as a worldview issue, in other words, if you have the right worldview, you will support Trump. If you don't support Trump, there's something wrong with your worldview. And says he quickly loses respect for pro-lifers who support Biden. He takes a different approach to Black Christians who vote Democratic. He doesn't agree with them. This is where it gets very interesting.
This gets really creepy, honestly.
Really interesting. He doesn't agree with them, he says, but they have, quote, historical reasons to vote the way they vote. So they're still brothers and sisters in Christ. Mohler doesn't consider those reasons in his redundant apologetic for Trump. They have their reasons. We have ours, seems to be his line. So Mohler, and I'm reading it, trying to figure out, what are you saying exactly? He understands that African-American Christians do not support Donald Trump. 92% supported Hillary Clinton in 2016, according to Pew, of validated voters. 3% supported Trump. He has just declared support for the Democratic candidate a sign of wrong thinking and a flawed worldview. And now he's facing the fact that his position is effectively declaring 9 out of 10 African-American Christians as having a flawed worldview. And that's awkward. It's not a great look. So his justification is they vote the way they vote for historical reasons. And Michael Weir, I think, correctly points out, well, shouldn't you at least list those reasons and decide if those reasons would influence any non-Black Christian to vote the way Black Christians are voting? Or are you, in essence, saying Black Christians get it wrong, but we'll give them a pass because they don't know better?
It was really weird. And I don't want to put words in Mohler's mouth, but essentially what it felt like to me was they're too dumb. They're blinded by their own history, and they don't see straight. They can't make out a coherent Christian worldview, because if they could, they would vote for Trump. And that is so insulting. And the fact that he doesn't list any of the historical reasons why a Christian of color might vote Democrat instead of Republican is essentially to say all those reasons, all those historical reasons, are illegitimate and shouldn't even be mentioned, let alone respected.
Right, because
So
he's already this is where it gets it's hard to say that this isn't offensive. I'm not saying it is, but it's hard to say it isn't.
I'm offended.
I'm walking the line there. He lists the things that should matter to Christians: LGBT issues, abortion, and religious liberty, and then acknowledges that they don't seem to matter the correct amount to Black Christians because they're working off a different framework, without ever considering, is it possible that that framework is valid?
Right.
Kaitlyn, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the line that was the most concerning to me was the one where he basically said voting for Biden, or maybe not voting for Trump, one of those two, was beyond his moral imagination. And then it was pretty quickly after that he made this description of Black Christians having other reasons for it. And it was almost like an almost instructive in a positive way section, because I just thought, yes, like the moral imagination of a Christian should be shaped not only by Christians in their own tradition, but by Christians around the world and throughout history, and especially Christians who occupy a position that most of the writers of the Bible occupied, of being marginalized from the bottom. And so for you to kind of say, yeah, they have a different perspective, it's for their own reasons, they're sort of biased by it, but I have this neutral position, is really to, almost in a weird backwards way that he's not intending, but seemed pretty clear in that moment to me, to acknowledge that you're coming from a powerful position, and that means that you're more right than the ones who have been marginalized by their history. Instead of recognizing, I think the more Christian thing would be to say, my moral imagination should be primarily shaped by those marginalized voices, not because they're more right, but because the powerful voices are already loud enough. And so my focus should be on understanding their perspective and having my moral imagination stretched and challenged because of my own history biasing me in certain ways, just as I'm assuming that theirs biases them.
Can I offer a cynical explanation?
Oh no, Skye.
I know.
The world is so cynical, Skye. Why do you have to add?
Because I think it might shed a lot of light on what's really going on here.
Oh, no. Okay. I'm just going to say right now up in front, I don't know what Skye's going to say, and I don't necessarily endorse it. Okay. Okay.
There's been quite a bit of murmuring that Al Mohler may be positioning himself for the presidency of the Southern Baptist Convention. And
I have heard that.
Yes. And so to maintain the position he had in 2016, which is that it's not morally acceptable for a Christian to vote for Trump, would mean he would never make it to the presidency of the Southern Baptist Convention.
Never going to be president now.
Right, exactly.
Never going to be president now.
In his calculus, and I think part of the reason maybe he was thinking that back in 2016, but like all the rest of us, he didn't think Trump would actually win. So this issue would disappear.
Right. And that was Russell Moore's case too, is he didn't think Donald Trump was going to win when he took a position against him that almost cost him his job in the SBC.
So when you read Mohler's article this week through the lens of a guy who's trying to posture himself in the right place to get the votes of Southern Baptists to become the president of the convention, it makes more sense why his argument is kind of ridiculous and so flawed, because it's not about being morally consistent. It's not about honoring the perspective of African-American believers. It's not even about being consistent with his own argument from 2016. It's about appeasing the people he needs to vote for him to be president of the Southern Baptist Convention. In that regard, I think the article is probably very successful.
Oh boy. And there's a significant presence of African-American churches within the SBC, which they've tried to cultivate. We want to, because, it gets away from that whole slavery founding issue. So they want to be open and diverse and embracing. So you can't just say, by the way, all of our African-American Southern Baptists, well, not all of them, 90% of them are wrong in their worldview, broken in their worldview. That's awkward to say if you want their support. So you end up in a very strange, Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that, Kaitlyn, or do you think we covered it? It just seems bizarre.
Skye's explanation makes sense, but it also is just really sad.
It's sad.
That's my motto. I make sense, but I'm sad.
Yeah.
I mean, Wayne.
Isn't that Eeyore's motto?
Oh my goodness! I never saw the similarity until now. Wayne Grudem. I disagree with him, but I think his logic holds up from his point of view. These are the things that I am prioritizing, and this is why, I am getting the things I prioritize, so I am ignoring other things. Al Mohler seems to be all over the place. Okay, one last thing. And I really wanted to hear Kaitlyn's point of view on this. I hear lots of people saying we have to, and Al Mohler, Wayne Grudem, et cetera, saying we have to, here's what we have to lose. If we don't have another 4 years of Trump, if the Democrats take over, all these bad things are going to happen. Terrible, terrible things are going to happen if the White House is blue. I wrote a piece, and I'm not going to publish it. I decided I'm not going to publish it because enough. Because it's if it has my name on it, unless I say it's from Skye. Well, here's Skye.
Just write the introduction, Phil.
Yeah, I'll just do the introduction if you make me. But basically saying, what is the cost of losing the suburbs to the conservative movement? Because I live in DuPage County, Illinois. It's a suburb, completely suburban county of 1 million people. And then Orange County, California, a completely suburban, so no major city in either of these counties. Orange County, California, completely suburban suburb, 3 million people. Okay, between Orange County, California, and DuPage County, Illinois, 4 million people. That is more than 32 states. So these just two little suburban counties have more population than 32 states. If they were a city together, only New York City would be bigger than Orange County, California, and DuPage County, Illinois. Both of them have incredibly strong Christian presence. Orange County, California, Robert Schuller and the Hour of Power and the Crystal Cathedral, and Rick Warren and the Purpose-Driven Everything, and Saddleback and Biola and Talbot Seminary and TBN, the Christian Broadcasting Empires in Orange County, California. And then DuPage County, it's Wheaton College, and it's Willow Creek and Bill Hybels and the Seeker-Sensitive Movement. And two of the major current popular Bible translations come from DuPage County, the Living and the ESV. So these are incredibly Christian places, incredibly big places, influential places, and they have been solid red since Reagan. And in 2018, Donald Trump flipped them both blue. And a whole host of congressmen, two here local that I knew that were strong evangelical Christian congressmen, pro-life, pro-Bible, pro-religious liberty, got sent packing just because they were in the same party as Donald Trump. And there's a lot of conversation that Orange County, California is probably blue for good. It may be lost just because of changing demographics and other issues. DuPage County, Illinois, maybe not. It's more conservative than Orange County, California. But I live in a town in DuPage County, Illinois that is 52% Latino, and it's not, nowhere in DuPage County is getting whiter. It's getting younger and browner. And I just read a piece about a similar county to Orange or DuPage outside Dallas-Fort Worth that may actually be in play this year, has the potential this or maybe in 4 years of turning blue for the first time, in forever. What is, if you say that there are values championed by the conservative movement that are biblical. Okay, we're not saying that all the conservative movement's values are biblical, and we're not saying that none of the Democratic Party's values are biblical, but there are biblical values that are championed by the conservative movement that are not championed by the progressive movement. Is 4 more years of Donald Trump worth the potential of 10 to 20 years of never being able to win another national election because the suburbs, particularly suburban women, have turned on you because of all the things they hate about Donald Trump? Can you possibly gain enough in 4 years from a guy that suburban women hate to make it worth losing the suburbs for 20 years? I don't hear any of these guys talking about that because it seems like even from a pragmatic point of view, Al Mohler might say, ooh, we have a lot to lose, not just a lot to gain by another 4 years of associating, because it took Donald Trump 2 years to flip Orange County and DuPage County. Okay. And they're now even more blue 2 years after that. 4 more years, half the suburbs are gone from the conservative movement. Okay, Kaitlyn, am I barking up the wrong tree? What's wrong with that argument?
No, I
And
think that's
I'm not saying that's why no one should vote for Donald Trump. I'm just saying, why isn't anyone talking about this?
Yeah, I think part of it, we are so short term in our thinking, both politically and then I think in the church, spiritual. I mean, same kind of thing of what is the long term cultural and political cost to this particular, wedding that has happened
Right,
between the church
right.
and not just the Republican Party, which is its own historical problem, but particularly with Donald Trump, the person that should have been like
Right.
the thing that stopped the line and we reevaluate this relationship. It didn't. There's long-term political effects for that, and there's long-term spiritual church-wide effects for that. I mean, one of the things that concerns me a lot as someone who's like talking to young Christians in their 20s and 30s all the time is that we have no kind of language or framework for thinking about politics other than total loyalty based on moral principles, that this is the preeminent issue and everything else kind of goes justified under it. But if we've realized that Donald Trump is not the person and abortion isn't the issue, we will find another party and another issue to work in that same framework and logic. And so those people, at my church in Dallas, those people in the 2 counties you're talking about that are maybe young evangelicals or just young, more conservative people, but they've been given this framework and logic. It makes a lot of sense that if Donald Trump is finally the line that they can't cross, it's not like they'll come up with a different kind of political imagination that allows them to be strategic in all these other ways. They're still going to be shaped by the framework and logic that their parents and elders handed down to them. And so the likelihood is, and I see this in people in my own church who are waking up to political problems that evangelicals have ignored, but then are forming the same kind of like quasi-idolatrous relationship with the left or picking one other political issue that then has to be the preeminent one and everything else can be justified under it. And again, like it's one of those things where if we see in our parents the fact that this was something that happened to them when they were pretty young, these are the political decisions they made, they haven't wavered at all from that. Yet we're not often as careful enough with young people in our churches to go, the things that form them right now, that could be the kind of trajectory they're on for a very long time, and is in 20 years the kind of really pragmatic logic of voting for Donald Trump. Once it's divorced from this particular context and this particular person, are we going to love that logic in 20 years when it's applied to a different situation with maybe less favorable circumstances? I don't think so.
Right. I mean, who is going to be in Washington arguing for pro-life values if the Republican Party has no power at all because they wedded themselves to a man who completely turns off suburban women who make up a huge part of the voting demographic?
Phil, the trajectory that you're talking about began a long time ago, and I think Trump just accelerated it. One of the stats that was kind of surprising to me is that in the last 30 years, the Republicans have only won the popular vote in a presidential election once. Once in 30 years. They've won it 3 times, but 2 of those 3 times they lost the popular vote in 2000 and 2016, but won by the Electoral College. So that's why after the Republican Party lost in 2012, when Mitt Romney ran against Obama, they did what's now famously known as the autopsy.
The autopsy.
And there was a deep dive into the demographic reality of the country and what it meant for the future of the Republican Party. And some of the suggestions they mentioned were we need to reform our thinking about race. We need to appeal to more Latinos and African Americans. We need to rethink our immigration policies and standards. George W. Bush understood this and made a significant effort to seek immigration reform and appeal to Latino voters. And then Trump comes along and all that got thrown out. And he had this Hail Mary win in 2016 that the Electoral College gave him because it disproportionately weights rural states. But the smart Republican strategists know that this is not a long-term winning strategy. They have to change. We are watching the death of the Republican Party. And I'm not saying that the name Republican is going to go away, but at some point in the not too distant future, to be a viable national party, they're going to have to change. They're going to have to win more of those suburban voters. And sadly, it might mean they jettison some of the biblical values that people do appreciate about historic Republican platforms, which means you're only accelerating the death of the issues that you actually care about most.
Why isn't Al Mohler talking about this? Why isn't Wayne Grudem talking about this? Even John Piper. Why wouldn't John Piper mention that, hey, this might be a really bad, or, evangelicals for Biden? They're not talking about that. Everyone's just talking about like the whole world is summed up by the next 4 years and what policy decisions are made in the next 4 years. And then that will be, I've read 2 pieces in the last week. One argued that if Joe Biden wins, it's the end of America as we know it. The other one argued that if Donald Trump wins a second term, it's the end of America as we know it. So all we know is that in 4 years, America is done.
Do you remember the James Dobson letter from 2008?
Yes.
No.
James Dobson wrote a letter.
Kaitlyn, you were 7.
I don't remember it happening,
but you know
I
what I'm
read
talking
it.
about. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So
were you even 7?
Really, people.
I was in 8th grade.
People should Google this. People should Google this and read it, because James Dobson wrote a letter in 2008. This is before the election. It was between John McCain and Barack Obama, if you recall. And it was, I think, a letter from 2012 America. And he's talking about what America looks like if Barack Obama wins the White House. And it's like this hellscape where like children are being aborted on every corner. And, there's just, I don't know, gay rape happening in every school. It's just horrible, like catastrophic evil that has engulfed the whole country. And of course, Barack Obama did win in 2008, and America is still here, and none of the craziness. So this happens every time.
Have I ever told you where I was the morning after the 2008 election?
No.
I was at Focus on the Family headquarters.
Were they tearing their clothes and wailing?
I just happened to be standing outside the glass of the radio studio while James Dobson was doing his radio show the morning after Obama won the White House. And he said a couple of things that kind of stunned me. One was that the shock of Obama winning was like getting struck with a hammer in the back of his head. The second one was something to the effect of, and America just isn't going to look like us anymore.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, this is,
He was saying the quiet part out loud.
Anyway, yeah. So we've been assuming that hell is right around the corner for a very long time. But it's kind of, because on the left, man, if Trump wins, it's the Handmaid's Tale. It's the Handmaid's Tale. If Amy Coney Barrett, Omer Kamey, it's the Handmaid's Tale. We're all wearing red dresses and in servitude. And so everyone's crazy. Do they actually believe that? I think Eric Metaxas actually believes that, because I read one of his pieces. I think he really does. And I assume there are people on the left that actually believe that. But there's also the element of, like Donald Trump's American Carnage speech, which was heavily influenced by Stephen Miller, his inauguration address, which was a description of America as if it had already been destroyed. So we just calm down. Just everybody calm down. We need to wrap this up. Kaitlyn. People are voting, and actually about half of them have already voted, so we missed that. But in the next week, people are voting. When you go into the poll booth, the voting place, the spot where you vote, it's like 7-Eleven, isn't it? I don't remember where it is. What are your priorities?
First, sanitizer. That's your first priority.
A mask. Yeah. Be safe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
what are you prioritizing?
Honestly, at the national level and the local level, there are different things. For me, when I'm thinking nationally, I'm thinking about both policy and character, partially because I think about elections in which we had no idea what happened immediately after an election. We had no idea COVID was going to happen. I think if we had maybe had a prediction about that, there are some people that might not have voted for Trump because there's different things that are required for so we don't know what's going to come. So I think about both of those things. But honestly, the thing that I keep talking to people about more is we have spent so much time and so much energy thinking about the national election. Spend some more time before you go vote thinking about local elections that have huge impact on your actual immediate neighbors. Like, I take really seriously that your vote is an act of love for your neighbor, but at the national level, that's abstracted out to a point that it's almost impossible for that to really be true. But locally, if you don't know the people in your literal neighborhood and their literal needs, especially the most vulnerable who will be impacted by policies that maybe you have the power or privilege to not be impacted by, that's an incredible act of loving your neighbor that can be tangible and can also be combined with like prioritizing certain things in a particular election, especially for things like judges and sheriffs and people where maybe the school board member, the pro-life issue is not suddenly going to kind of, be the whole thing that your vote has to be about. There's all sorts of different, positions that have different ability. The railroad commissioner in Texas has all of this power over environmental regulations. Like, so I'm going to think about a lot of that in a way that I wouldn't when it comes to a different kind of vote. But feeling the freedom to be creative and strategic when it comes to your vote and prioritizing the people who will be impacted by it and not just yourself, because that's the Christian way that we're supposed to do everything.
Prioritizing other people?
It's weird, I know.
Is that what you're saying? Skye?
I'm thinking about what David French said were his priorities in selecting a candidate. I think he was speaking specifically about presidents, but this applies even down ballot issues. One is character. We have to look at character because character is destiny, and that kind of gets into John Piper's argument that we already talked about. Secondly, does the person possess the competency to fulfill the requirements of the office that they're seeking? So whether it is the railroad commissioner or the coroner or the judge or the president, can they actually do the job? And I think that's a major issue on the ballot this year with the presidency, especially in COVID. A lot of people are questioning whether Trump really has the ability to lead the country sufficiently through this crisis. Only after somebody clears the bar of character and competency do you begin to ask questions about policy. Do they actually align on specific policy proposals with what I believe a Christian worldview would call us to in loving our neighbors and others? And obviously no party has a monopoly on that, so that's where priorities come into play. But I think David French is absolutely correct. If a candidate can't clear those first two bars of competency and character, the whole thing about policy it's not even a factor there. And I think that's a mature and appropriate way to evaluate a candidate.
Okay. I also think I made this point in my video on how should a Christian vote, because I'll, just think like the America First idea, and we have to put ourselves first, because if we put ourselves first, then we'll be so wealthy and so successful that we'll have extra cash to help others. And I look, we are in a position where we influence the world more than any other country. Where you can't, I just don't feel like, if you live in Botswana, you live in Luxembourg, you live in a tiny little place with no influence, you can just think about your own welfare. But we affect the welfare of everyone on earth. So we can't just say this is just about us, because we don't have that privilege. We do not have the privilege to say this is just about us. And it's not biblical.
Okay, Phil, just last thing to poke a hole in that.
What do you?
I agree with you.
You could do that.
No, I agree with you completely. But here's why.
You had that.
The James.
I think I can mute you.
The James Dobson letter in 2008 and all the hysteria that's going on right now about it's going to be the end of America. The reason why that rhetoric is so important is it's kind of the airplane decompression scenario, right? Which is if we're facing a catastrophe, if America is going to end right now, you have to put your own oxygen mask on first before you help those you're with. And it gives license to be selfish in the way you vote. Because we can't help the rest of the world if America doesn't exist in 3 years. So we have to vote a certain. So that panic is what fuels people from getting a broader perspective. So I think you're absolutely right, but that explains why fear plays such a big role in these things. They don't want people thinking that way.
Oh, the panic. There's so much fear. I'm, on the left, it's going to be Handmaid's Tale, and women won't be allowed to make any choices. And
they can't be cookers anymore.
They can't be cookers.
Or that's all they can be.
Or that's all they can be.
They can only be cookers.
We now view women more as appliances than as productive members of society. But we value their usefulness. Kaitlyn, we value you for your utility. And on the right, Trump was just at a rally 2 days ago and told seniors that if Joe Biden becomes president, he's going to turn off you'll have no air conditioning or heat. It's the end of air conditioning and heat.
My favorite is that the Democrats are going to kill all the birds with their windmills.
All the birds will be dead. Both sides are saying insane things to terrify you. And we are the people who are never supposed to be afraid. We don't need to be afraid. We have nothing to fear. So I just like, stop saying that. I'm going to just read about your policies and I'm going to decide, does this prioritize the needs of the least of these? Or does it prioritize the needs of the people that are already doing fine? And if that doesn't work, I just don't know what to do. Okay. I think we might have gone long enough that we don't need a guest, but we'll have to make that decision.
Yeah, we'll see where things land
later, I guess. Because Kaitlyn, it's been fun.
Thanks.
Do you get a lot of pushback from your liberty friends or your church friends for seeming a little too not orthodox Republican?
Church is more.
More.
I appreciate the thing you said about them both being retired pastors. I'm not a pastor, but I'm on staff at a church, so it's really complicated.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Well, God bless you. God bless you, everyone. So everybody, we're going to vote, right? Everyone's voting because we're citizens. Some people are saying, I'm a Christian and I just don't think I should participate. I'm not sure that's such a great argument, but that's a different episode. We're going to vote, and I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm telling you who to vote on behalf of, and it's people who don't have the ability to speak for themselves. We don't need to vote on behalf of ourselves if we're doing great and our friends are doing great. Vote on behalf of the least of these. Okay, and you can interpret that. I'm going to trust you to interpret what that means because I'm not telling you. Skye will tell you what it means, but I won't. He might even put me on the front of the video where he tells you what it means without telling me, and then I get the VeggieTales guy. Somebody called the abortion video what was it? A fictitious VeggieTales video or a fake VeggieTales? They actually called it a VeggieTales video.
Are they saying I look like a vegetable? I'm insulted by that.
Hey, we're going to do a special episode next week because we're going to be so excited to be done after the election. We're going to record Wednesday morning right after the election and debrief our experience of the prior 24 hours. And that will be the episode that comes out Wednesday. We've never done a same day record and release, but we're doing that next Wednesday.
Have fun editing that one, Jason.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. I think after 2016, we did something similar, but it was the next day after.
Okay.
So this will be quicker.
We will be outside in the streets with microphones, just kind of recording the chaos, the planes falling from the sky, people throwing furniture at each other. It's going to be awesome. Okay. Do you want to wrap it up, Skye? Tell them where to go, what to do.
Yeah, if you guys want to, get more of this marvelous content and more videos where I am just Phil's puppet.
When you sound sarcastic when you're pitching for new subscribers, I'm not sure.
Yeah, go to holypost.com and click on the support us button, and you can become a Patreon supporter and get all kinds of bonus material, extra interviews, swag, monthly access to a live stream where you can ask us questions, behind the scenes
We just did
stuff.
one today. It was fun.
Yeah, so we appreciate everybody who's supporting the podcast and its other outlets. You make it possible. Grateful for that. You can also support me by signing up for my daily devotional at withgoddaily.com. We're doing a series right now about the church, and it's challenging and hopefully encouraging. And of course, you can get Phil's stuff at mrphil.tv. Is that it?
That's right. mrphil.tv. Yeah, my kid stuff. Yeah, I forgot that I do kid stuff. I only make videos that make people mad at me.
And buy Kaitlyn's book, The Liturgy of Politics, which is
that's right, very
brilliant.
But you'll probably need to buy it fast if you want to read it, digest it, and then have it influence your choices in the election.
Yeah, because the book burning starts on November 4th.
Okay. Thanks for coming along, and we will see you guys in a week. It'll be great. Thanks, guys.
So here's a remarkable statistic. In 2018, Canada, a country with 1/10 the population of the United States, actually welcomed and resettled more refugees for the first time ever than the U.S. That's because the Trump administration has reduced the number of refugees allowed into the United States to its lowest number ever since the program began. They were able to do that largely with the support of white evangelicals, because they're the group most likely to see immigrants as a threat and the group least likely to say the U.S. has some moral obligation to welcome and resettle refugees. That's an amazing turnabout from the way it used to be. In the beginning of refugee resettlement programs, evangelicals led the way in the United States, and it was done largely through groups like World Relief. Today, my guest is Scott Arbeiter. He is the president of World Relief, and for those of you who don't know, World Relief is a part of the National Association of Evangelicals and has worked closely with the State Department and other state officials since World War II in resettling refugees here in the U.S. He's with me to talk about the state of this issue in the church, why there's a disconnect between evangelical leaders and the people in the pew, and what it means for our current political decision as we head into this election. So here's my conversation with Scott Arbeiter. Scott, welcome to the Holy Post. We're grateful to have you with us.
I'm glad to be with you, Skye.
Okay, so some of our listeners are going to be familiar a little bit with World Relief. We've had Matt Sorens on a couple of times, but what triggered wanting to get you on is that you and the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, took out a full-page ad recently in the Washington Post. Tell us a little bit about why you did that, what was the ad about, and how does it relate to where we are right now as a church in the United States?
Be glad to do that, Skye. You know, it really came out of some personal concerns that many of us who were in the leadership of both World Relief and the NAE were having. And that included conversations with people that were in positions of leadership with other relief and development agencies, seminary presidents, Bible college presidents, and all the rest of it. And we were just having this deep sense that the evangelical faith was being very narrowly defined in the marketplace broadly, if you will, that the voices that were being most often sought and amplified were voices that were giving a very narrow interpretation of our evangelical faith, really focusing on one or two issues as opposed to the broad set of commands that Christ gave to us to live out this gospel that is good news at every level of human existence. So we saw it being very narrowly defined, but we also saw it being misrepresented in a variety of places. For example, as you know, we work closely with refugees and have been in a terrific private-public partnership with the State Department for about 40 years, resettling refugees. And with the State Department as our partner, we've resettled nearly 300,000 refugees over that time. And we know the dignity of their lives. We know their entrepreneurship. We also know the trauma. And we know that so many of them were persecuted Christians, but we welcomed all that the State Department allocated to us. And they were being represented by some of these same evangelical voices in ways that were so demeaning to who they were as people. And they were robbing them of their dignity and of their place. And they were misrepresenting them as being this terribly dangerous group of people. That wasn't only for refugees. If you think of Waltersdorf quartet of the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the immigrant, and the refugee, and add to that the poor as a whole. And there was so much conversation that seemed to be attacking those populations, less so certainly the widow and the orphan. But as we looked at that, we thought, we need to get another counter narrative out. And a lot of people of color in particular, but also a lot of other evangelical Christians came to us and said, isn't there some way that we can have a voice because we feel like ours has been taken away? So we listened carefully to that and we said, we think we can do that responsibly. And we wrote a statement that is founded on For the Health of the Nation. It's a standing document by the NAE, written in 2004, updated just recently, representing a broader, more comprehensive view of this gospel that we as evangelicals have given our lives to. And so our desire was to be able to create a dialogue and a conversation among evangelicals to say, do we need to have a broader view of this gospel that is humble, that is thoughtful, that is broadly biblical? Our goal was to be both pastoral and prophetic, and to be timely to the times, but also rooted in the scriptures, And so that's the statement we put in, and we asked people to sign on to it. And we've got about 2,000 various evangelical leaders who have signed on to date from a lot of different constituencies. And most often what we're hearing is gratitude. Hey, thanks for giving us a chance to take a different posture than what we're hearing out there.
And I'm grateful for that as well. You mentioned not having a platform, not feeling heard, that there are evangelical voices right now that are being platformed in the media and certainly by this current administration, which I would say probably wouldn't agree with the document that the NAE has created that stands by for the health of the nation, because it is such a broad vision of what Christian cultural engagement really looks like and a faithfulness to the gospel looks like. What do you have to say to those voices that seem to have eclipsed historic evangelicalism in our culture today? What do we do with that?
You know, it's interesting. I think the best thing is to, as we're able, engage people in conversation as opposed to debate, and to lead with questions as opposed to attacks. But I think, you know, as is so often the case, Tim Keller is helpful on this. One of the things he's done is he's looked at the broad narrative of Scripture. He says, you know, there are really 4 places where there are key ethical themes for us to follow. He said there's racial justice, there's poverty and marginalization, there's sanctity of life, and there's sexual purity. He said those 4 just arise out of the Scriptures regularly. He said what's interesting is that 2 of those align to a conservative agenda and 2 of those align to a liberal agenda. And when you think about that, you have to recognize that no one agenda encompasses the totality of the biblical narrative and the biblical call. So what we've been hoping in this is that we could begin a dialogue to say, come, let us reason together. Let's look at the fullness of the biblical call. Let's make room for one another in this dialogue without capitulating on our belief in the Scriptures as our guide for our practice and our belief, our orthodoxy and our orthopraxis. At the same point, we've got to recognize that we've gotten really narrow in some of our beliefs. And actually, our political agenda drives more of our dialogue than our biblical agenda does.
That's a theme that reoccurs on this podcast a lot. So it's you don't have to sell it to us by any means. We see it all the time. You mentioned when we were talking about the full page ad that you and the National Association of Evangelicals took out in the Washington Post and the thousands of evangelical leaders who signed on in support of that. How do you reconcile the gap that exists between the thousands of evangelical leaders who clearly and theologically support what World Relief is doing and what surveys are saying about the evangelicals who are sitting in the church pews, that many of them do not support the resettlement of refugees. They do not support the immigration policies that have existed in the United States. They do feel threatened, particularly by non-white immigrants coming into the country. What do we do about that gap between the leaders and the people, where we need the support and the financial backing of the people in order to keep this good work happening?
Yeah, it's a great question, Skye. Let me give you 2 thoughts on that. There is a gap between many pastors and their congregations on this, and that gap would appear to be widening. I think the first reason would be the lens through which we look at the question. So for many pastors who have spent a long time studying the Scriptures, they know that the biblical call to the orphan, the widow, the immigrant, the refugee, the stranger is so deeply rooted in the Scriptures. And in fact, if you take a look at the Old Testament, there is no greater call, no call often mentioned more often than the care for the refugee and the immigrant, except for there is one Lord, your God, and you shall worship no other. And so they know that narrative. They know God's preferential heart for the poor and the marginalized, and they live out of that and they seek to speak out of that. So their lens is different. For many in the congregations, their first lens actually is their socioeconomic and political lens. So if you think, for example, of a funnel by which we get our information, for many people, the top end of that funnel is a 24/7 news cycle, whatever source that happens to be. And for some, it's MSNBC, and they have one point of view. For another, it's Fox, they have another point of view. But if that is the top of our funnel, And then it comes down to, okay, beyond that political, then I have a sociological, I have an economic view. And way down here, I remember a Bible verse or two about this. And my pastor once said something 3 years ago in a sermon that I really can't remember. So I think that the first question is, what is the lens we're using? Our goal has been to try to flip that model and say, let's look at this first biblically. Then let's look at it humanly. How would we want to be treated if, in fact, the experience of the asylum seeker that is seeking to flee violence in the Northern Triangle, or the refugee, a persecuted Christian, or a persecuted person of no faith, if we were that person, how would we want to be treated? So biblical, then human.
That's also very biblical, though, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, Jesus said something about that.
I think he did, yeah.
And then social, economic, and political matter, but they should not be the drivers. So I think that's the first reason why there's this gap. I think the second one is in the quality of the information that we get. If the information we get is basically telling us that immigrants and refugees are very, very dangerous people, we're going to be fearful. I had a conversation in the White House with one of Mike, Vice President Pence's staff, and we were talking about this, and he's a faithful believer. And I said, I'm having some difficulty understanding, and maybe you can help me explain to the 1,000+ churches that we're working with in the US, why is this picture painted of the refugee population being so dangerous? I said, because the reality is, and these are State Department figures, of 3 million refugees resettled since the Refugee Act took place in 1980, not a single American has lost their life to a terror act sponsored by a refugee. 3 million and zero. You're not going to find 3 million people named Scott or Leonard or Dave or Linda that is safer than that population. In fact, they estimated, the Cato Institute estimated that any single American's chance of being killed in a terror attack by a refugee was 1 in 3.64 billion, which is about the same chance that on your drive to the hardware store, you're going to both win the lottery and get killed by a stray golf ball. It is infinitesimally small. They are the most vetted group of people. If you're a terrorist and you want to get in the US, the last thing you want to do is go through 18 to 24 months of vetting. So when you look at that information, most Americans don't have access to that.
Yeah, but most fears aren't rational to begin with, right? Because that doesn't work. Fear is irrational most often. And it's a very effective political tool. So it's far easier to say that person or that group of people looks different than you, believes differently than you, has different customs and practices than you, and they're obviously therefore a threat. That's kind of a visceral, basic, fear-based appeal, which is so powerful in so many communities. So I applaud you for wanting to bring facts into the light so that people can see them. But I sometimes I'm concerned that the fear is just so powerful that facts, they're bringing a knife to a gunfight. In our time remaining, let's talk about the current situation and how some of the policies that the government is now activating have impeded the work of World Relief. And especially, how is this current election kind of shaping up? 2 years ago in 2018, during the midterms, immigration was a big topic. Right now, I'm not hearing anything about it. I'm not hearing about refugees. I'm not hearing about the southern border. I'm not hearing any of that stuff because everything's eclipsed by coronavirus and other issues. What do Christians need to know right now before they begin the process of voting that maybe they're not hearing?
Skye, there are so many things that as believers we should be paying attention to with regard to this election season, and more broadly, just because it's right for us to live our lives in faithfulness. But I want to start in one place. It has to do with our identity as believers. I'm concerned for us as Christians that we have come to think that politics is the ultimate thing. And there's a certain idolatry in that. We think that if our party wins, that somehow we will enjoy this wonderful path ahead. If our party loses, it's all over, as though there wasn't a sovereign God under which we live our lives. So I think there's a risk of an idolatrous view of politics that we should be careful about. And so that would be one of my first concerns, because whether you're Republican or Democrat, in the seeking of power, we may actually erode the very power of the faith that we proclaim. And in gaining the power, we may become more dependent upon that and less dependent on the Christ who empowers our lives for the godliness that we're called to. So that's one thing I would just say broadly. Now, I know that you guys have been talking about race on the podcast, and I think that is a terrifically important issue. We ought to be asking, how do we elevate our national character? How do we elevate our national conversation in such a way that we honor the Imago Dei, the image of God in every person? Our policies ought to be seeking the flourishing of all people. And if it's very narrowly defined, I think we're not being consistent with the gospel call. And so I think we have to broaden our view of what does it mean for people to flourish. That's why in the For the Health of the Nation, we list 8 different things, everything from the notion of the sanctity of life to creation care, to racial reconciliation. My call would be for all of us as believers to embrace the whole counsel of God. Now, because we work with the population of refugees, and you asked about that specifically in the administration policies, that's a real concern to us. And it should be for many Christians as well, particularly with regard to persecuted Christians. There was a stated policy by both President Trump and Vice President Pence that we are going to do more for persecuted Christians. We're going to serve them better. The reality is that the number of persecuted Christians that have been allowed into the country under the current administration from countries like Iran and Iraq with the greatest persecution of believers has fallen over 90% in both of those cases. The number of persecuted Christians being allowed in the country has been dramatically slashed, despite the promises. And we've published, along with Open Doors, a report that can be found on our World Relief website that details from each of the countries what is happening. Now, we're convinced that as Americans, we've had a terrific history of recognizing the trauma of the refugee and embracing not only persecuted Christians, but persecuted people of other faith or no faith at all. But for believers who really care about their brothers and sisters around the world who are undergoing tremendous persecution, I think that's an issue we ought to be calling whatever administration is in place to pay attention to.
Agreed, absolutely. What have you heard anything coming out of either campaign leading up to this election about a change in policy, regardless of who wins? Is the Trump administration saying they'll do anything in a second term? Is the Biden camp saying that they would lift these numbers? What have you heard?
Yes, as you may know, the average presidential determination, which is what sets the number of refugees that are allowed into the country, has averaged about 85,000 over the course of history. It has fallen each year under President Trump too. Now they've declared that for 2021 to be 15,000. And because they're dismantling the whole process by which refugees are vetted and allowed in, it's very possible that they could look at 15,000 and say, well, sorry, we couldn't do it because we dismantled the processes by which it takes place. On the other side of that, Vice President Biden has made a declaration that his intent would be to lift that cap, to return it to normalcy, and in time get to 120 to 150,000 refugees. Now, let's put that in perspective for just a moment. There are 80 million displaced people in the world. 26 million are refugees. There are 260 million persecuted Christians in the world. So when we're talking about the possibility of 120 to 150,000 who can still be very, very carefully vetted, we're not going to solve the global problem by doing that. But I think it's not only important for us keeping our promise and our history and our national character, keeping our promises to those who aided us and our military in Iraq and Iran, where we've broken the promise to bring them in, but it also impacts our ability to lead the world in this, because when America leads, other countries open up their generosity. But right now, Canada, at 1/10 of our population, is resettling more refugees than the United States is. And Our position has been national security is a very appropriate administration prerogative, and it's a responsibility. But compassion and national security do not have to be held as binary and mutually exclusive. We can do both. We've done both for many years, and we believe we should return to that.
Wow. Scott, the United States should be a moral leader in the world. And within the United States, the church should be its moral leader. And it feels like, sadly, we have let both of those responsibilities fall. And I'm grateful for leaders like you and others who are reminding us of that call and who are working even with the resources and limitations that are currently on you to do what's right and do what's best. But I do hope that in the coming years, we can see more evangelicals stand up and say, we care about the least and the forgotten, the refugee, the persecuted Christian brother or sister, and meet this need, even if it can't be addressed 100%. There's a lot more we can do, more we've done in the past and more we can do in the future. So we're very grateful for that reminder. One last time before we wrap up, what resources would you point our audience to? You mentioned the evangelical immigration table where they can get those that walk through scripture on what the Lord says about this issue. Where can people find the Health of the Nation document that's been put out by the NAE?
If they go to forthehealthofthenation.net, or they go to the NAE website or World Relief website, they can find access to it.
I think that it's not a long document. I think that would be a really useful thing for everyone to look at and read through as they contemplate their vote. As you put earlier, there is no political party that has a monopoly on any of these virtues. So it isn't like you walk away from it and you're clearly going to vote one way or another. But I think it will give folks a framework, historical, theological framework for thinking Christianly about their responsibility as a citizen.
Yes, and the goal again is to be pastoral and prophetic, not partisan. If I can offer one thing on that point, Skye, for those who are concerned, is this all about being political? It's a fair question, but we should define our terms. If by political, people ask that question, meaning, is World Relief or the NAE becoming partisan? Are you going to support a party or candidate? The answer is clearly no. We have not, we will not. But if you allow me to define politics as the art of public policy, our calling as followers of Jesus does not excuse us from that conversation. In fact, it demands that we're in it because we should be working for the flourishing of all people. So our call is that we would be policy oriented because our gospel is the richest way to inform that policy. And to your point, the church ought to be in the lead on that. Let's step up to our calling. Let's live out that grace and truth of Christ. And it will challenge both political parties. And it will challenge us, and the nation will be richer for it.
Amen. And just, there are so many issues that we as Christians and as churches can engage in without having to deal with the government. But when it comes to refugees and immigration policy, there is no way for us to engage those without engaging the federal government. So it's a necessity of our love for our neighbor that we have to engage in these policy issues. And that means sometimes getting quote unquote political while we remain nonpartisan. So thank you for taking that on at a time when it's as difficult as ever. And thank you for your input to our audience. And again, go to forthehealthofthenations.net, go to the evangelical immigration table.com.net. Todd, you'll figure it out. Google it.
.org and worldrelief.org.
And worldrelief.org. Scott, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Skye.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.